Lovely to be here tonight. And I've got to the stage of life where I need reading glasses and I've forgotten my hearing aids. So if you can't hear, could you let me know? Could you just, make it obvious if I'm not projecting enough or if the mic isn't picking it up enough, because I just don't trust my senses anymore at the moment. It's lovely to be here. Really nice to be back in Lincolnshire. I was brought up just near Boston. Spent the first 18 years of my life in Butterwick near Boston. And so very fond memories of this part of the world and coming to the cathedral on school trips and Sunday school outings and so on. So lovely to be back and back with you all tonight. I do feel a little bit as if, how on conferences, usually if it's a day conference, the session after lunch is the graveyard slot. I feel it's like that, only quadrupled. It's Friday night. You've just had supper. You've had 2 days now of gathering and another day to go tomorrow and probably, the Sunday to work after that. So yes, and a Fleetwood Mac concert to deal with. I mean, we're on a loser, but we will do our best to see where we go with this wonderful subject of Hugh said, can you think about the image of God in children? And so I'm thinking about that tonight. I don't think it'll be controversial. I don't think it'll be anything that you haven't thought of before. But I hope it'll be a reminder of some of those things that you've thought about and understood in your own ministries with so many children, in homes, in churches, in schools, other walks of life before you were a minister, perhaps. We'll see where we get to anyway. But I wanted to start off thinking about, when I hear the phrase, the image of God, I always, the picture for me, the image of God for me, is the icon of the Trinity by Rublev, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And please, if you don't know it, feel free to Google it while we talk. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, isn't it? It's just an amazing picture that the more you look at it, the more you think, oh, the more there is to see in this. And the more you know you don't know about it. A very beautiful window on God, inspired stuff. And I'm feeling very exercised about my relationship with Russia at the moment, as I'm sure a lot of us are. Because on the one hand, they've given us this beautiful icon that's brought so many people closer to God, closer to an understanding of that Trinitarian God. And on the other hand, Ukraine. And it's been particularly vibrant for us, particularly, close to the bone for us, because last year in July we welcomed a Ukrainian couple, and they came as our guest on July the 5th, I think it was, and 2 weeks later had a baby. So we've now got 3 Ukrainians in the house, and I did have a rather tense time when I knew what day they were arriving. I was straight on the blower to the local GP surgery saying, she's 9 months pregnant. If she goes into labour after a 30-hour journey across Europe, what do I do? And so they said, dial 999. The midwife said, no, you call the midwives. It was quite educational. So yes, a lot of what my thinking tonight comes from is our Ukrainian baby, because it's a huge privilege to actually live with a baby again and never have to change a nappy. It's kind of rather wonderful. Very beautiful thing. And I may never be a grandparent, We've got 2 children, they're adults, but they show no signs of producing children, and why should they? So this may be the nearest I get to being a grandmother. So when Uliana said in passing, oh, you know, we think of you as Baba Lucy, I thought, oh, that's cracking, that is. That's really, really lovely. A great privilege. But I thought hanging tonight on the icon of the Trinity, despite what Russia's doing, actually has a lot of resonance. And I don't know if you saw in the news recently, but Mr. Putin has taken it out of the museum and placed it in the cathedral. And there's this art historian guy with a name which I'm not going to say because it just sounds rude in English. So Lev, no, I'm not going to say his surname, but he says the gallery's Restoration Council was categorically against this moving of the icon. While the icon was in the museum with a team of restorers, it was like a person in intensive care. It was being monitored around the clock and by the most modern equipment. This is a political decision. And it just made me think about this beautiful image of God that's being probably not manhandled, but it's being put at risk and being used for political gain, being abused, actually, and just thinking about that very holy thing being manipulated and used wrongly, and just about the vulnerability of children in our care in the church, and how often we got it wrong in the past as well. I think that needs saying, and what a privilege it is to have those children in our communities, wanting to keep them safe, not wanting them to be an object. And so as we kick off tonight, rather than objectifying children in the abstract, do you think you could just think of a child or a young person that you know? It might be someone in your family, it might be someone in your local school or church, it might be a child off the television, a celebrity child, but a child that you know or know of. And just turn to the person next to you, go into threes if nobody's left out, and just tell the other person about your real child. What are they like? Why have you thought of them? Just share that child with the person next to you. Great, let's come back together again. It's wonderful, isn't it? That it's really great that there was nobody in the room who was staring into space going, I don't know any children, I have no contact with children at all. Everybody in the room was thinking and talking about a child that you know. And sometimes I find it really frustrating working with churches because I get this sort of plaint of, oh, well, we don't have any children, and there are no children in the village, and no children for 3,000 miles around. And you think, you do know children. All of us are connected to children. There are children around. If they're not in the village, where are they? They are going to school somewhere. They are perhaps the grandchildren of people in your congregation or great-grandchildren. You have connections. You can have a heart for children wherever you are. I remember visiting once on the Messy Church days, visiting the Costa del Sol, which was quite fun, where they were doing a Messy Church down there. And I said, forgive me, but this seems like quite an older community, Christian community of British people out here on the Costa del Sol, who are the church. How do you do a messy church? And they said, every summer our children drop off their children on their grandparents, and we end up as a community with lots and lots of grandchildren. And it's lovely to be able to welcome them into our chaplaincy. So, a great gift, a great gift. We're thinking, it's a very simple structure for tonight. Just going to think a bit about how children are not perhaps like the image of God. They're not the image of God. They're very different from the image of God. And how they could be seen to be the image of God. There'll be a little bit of chatting to your neighbour, but I hope nothing too threatening as we go through. So, oh yeah, and I hope you'll never see a spatula in quite the same way again. Yeah. So, let's see. Could you think back to when you were a child? And can you think back to the first time you had an inkling of God? Perhaps you had a picture of God in your heart or mind from books, from family, from songs that you sang, from nature, maybe spontaneously from God. How old were you then, and what was that picture of God that you had? What's the earliest memory that you have of having a sensation of God or an image of God? Again, just tell the person next to you how old you were and what sort of picture of God you had at that age. Take 2 minutes. Thank you, lovely. So, just out of interest, and I don't know if can you see the people on the other side from where you're sitting? This is for interest, really. So if you can't see the people around, do just sort of lean or shift yourself so that you can see them. I'm just going to ask, what age were you in that earliest memory? What was your age? So can you put your hand up if it was kind of between 15 and 20 for your earliest memory of God? Thank you. Thank you. What about between kind of 10 and 14? What about between 5 and 9? And what about under 5? Yeah, kind of, yeah. How interesting. In this room of people who have committed their lives to a calling from God and have that lifelong, full-time commitment in so many ways. What an interesting age when you came to know something of God. That 0 to 10 age group was the biggest by far, and it's something which we take really seriously in growing faith. This idea that children have this spirituality that makes them almost like a thin place, a place where it's very easy to be in touch with God, where there's a strong sense of God, where it's often easy to have a relationship with God. It's very, very natural. And sometimes as a church, we miss that. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important that we get our act together as churches, because if we're in the business of helping people to love God and to follow God and to know God more, what was the Richard of Chichester prayer that we mentioned tonight? Oh, know him more dearly, follow him more nearly, day by day, that one. If that's what we're about, if that's how we feel that those children have the best chance of thriving in a very difficult world, we can meet them at that very early age and help them to understand that spirituality in the light of the Christian faith. And what Jackie shared earlier was heartbreaking, wasn't it? Absolutely heartbreaking that that's still happening in our churches today. That for some reason, some of our members feel that children don't belong, that they're not fellow disciples, that they don't have a place at the table. Heartbreaking. But we can do something about it. So I was thinking about this Imago Dei stuff and thinking, there's a lot of children I know who are very different from God. Someone once said to me, oh, it must be nice, you love children, don't you? And I said, oh, I like some children, I don't like all children at all. Just like adults, really. But this idea of how are children different from God? And when I was thinking about it, there's the obvious, having had children who were not the easiest of children themselves. The whole stealing your brother's ice cream and demanding to go in the gift shop of the museum before you've even been round the museum. And there was one of those instances when my daughter was 2, which I thought was going to be a lovely, here is my child in nature with the Lord moment. And I said, we were outside the ancient church in Yorkshire, and I said, oh, look, Judith, look on the Yorkshire flags in the sunshine. There's a beautiful ladybird. And she bent down and she looked, and then she stamped on it. Where did that come from? So in lots of ways, children do not resemble God. And I think sometimes we think of it in terms of limitations. I found myself thinking a lot down limitations, the limitations of children, so that they seem to be kind of inadequate adults, let alone inadequate representations of God. So, their language is inadequate, and their physicalness, they're not as strong as adults or as resilient as adults, and they are not aware of things like time constraints and the fact that if you stand too near a pond, you are going to fall in, things like that. But for every limitation that I was thinking of, I found myself adding the two words, and yet, and yet. Because for every one of them, when you look at that through a Christian lens, you find yourself saying, children are so physically weak and vulnerable and frail and inadequate physically, and yet the maker of the universe, who could make galaxies with his little finger, chose to become a baby and needed to be wrapped in swaddling clothes to protect him, and was vulnerable to every germ in that spare room, in that stable, or whatever it was, every kind of clumsiness of the adults around him. He made himself physically very, very vulnerable, amazingly vulnerable, a fetus in a womb, really vulnerable. And when Jesus grew up, all the and yets started flooding in. So, yes, children are limited in their kind of, in their understanding. And yet Jesus chose to take on those limitations as well, and actually held up a child as the model for all these brainy adults to follow for their own discipleship. And yes, they're limited in terms of their awareness of time and space, but Jesus was always in the moment, very much like a child, actually. And that, the passages like, consider the birds of the air, the lilies of the field. Why are you worrying? Why are you grown-ups worrying? Look at this that's going on around you. There was that sense of Jesus being so confident in his bigger plan that he could dwell absolutely in the moment that he was in the place that he was in. And when you start thinking about the limitations of language of children, babies particularly, Veronica is very much at the kind of, that sort of, there's something really important that she's trying to say. I haven't the foggiest idea what it is. But how extraordinary that the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word had to learn language. What's going on there? So, with all the limitations of children, I found myself saying, and yet God became a child. And there's something in that, that Philippians 2-ness of it all, of God choosing to give up the strength and the power and the authority and the oomph and the lightning bolts and the kind of riding in on the clouds and all that domination to become a baby in a teenage girl's arms. And I think that in itself, his choice to do that, says something about how we can be released from our image of God as just all-powerful and all-dominant and majestic, that it's something as well about choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to be with the weak, choosing to be weak and to hang on a cross, that a child reminds us of. So that was an interesting journey for me, going through the limitations of children and finding that God chose to take all those on himself. Yeah. I was wondering as well, and I don't know what you think about this, about how it's possibly hard to see children as the image of God, because we never ever have the chance to see a child who is without fear. Every single child that we know knows fear from a very early age, either because of tragic circumstances or because we're in a fallen world and actually we have these existential fears within all of us. And I suspect every single person in this room has fears that maybe you've had since a child, since you were a child. And I just wonder if that stops us seeing something of the glory of God in children, the tragic way that the world makes children afraid and grow up, as adults fearing things. Again, what must Jesus have been like as a child, knowing no fear? And is that too big a thing to say? Was Jesus the only child who grew up knowing no fear? It's a really interesting thought, isn't it? He was tempted as we are, yet was without sin. And the 1 John 4 bit says, perfect love casts out fear. So I'm quite sure Jesus was tempted to be afraid on many an occasion. But if he was love embodied from being born upwards, does that mean that there was no room for fear in him? And what would that have been like? What would it have been like to know the child Jesus, a child without fear? I think it would have been, for parents, utterly terrifying. So it's that sense of, oh, good on Mary and Joseph. Wow, how did you do that? Yeah. So have a talk to your neighbour, because I think there's something really powerful in that idea of a child who never knew fear, was put in dangerous situations, was put at risk hugely. He was a refugee in his, before he was 5. He was taken off to Egypt, political victim, all that travelling, all that lack of antibiotics, all the obvious things. He must have been put into positions of danger in that natural world. But did he know fear? So again, just turn to your neighbour. What do you think? What was he like as a child without fear?
trust that you are with me. So that will turn off the emotions about how I react out of the decision I'm going to make. It's like same way I went through those temptations, temptations. So to say, well, Jesus is life, I feel like
Great, thank you. We might come back to that later in the discussion, questions and answers at the end, because I'm finding that a bit intriguing myself. Children as the image of God, reflecting God. Perhaps there is something about the fact that, quite simply, if we're all meant to reflect God, if we're all made in the image of God and we're trying to share that glory with the world, which is utterly terrifying if you just get your mind around it, isn't it? It's best not to think about it. The responsibility. But if children are reflecting the image of God, if they're like wobbly mirrors of the image of God, perhaps they are a bit shinier in many cases than we are. Perhaps some of us feel a bit like the icon of the Trinity that's been dropped on its way to the cathedral, a little bit battered around the edges, perhaps, a bit tarnished. And I think that's why it's so good that you've got gatherings like these to come to, and it's a little bit like the diocese saying to you, sit back and I will rub you with window lean. It's that kind of, this is a time to just be polished up again. And find yourself again, find that image of God in you. And I think there's something about a child, being exposed to a child, that also is a sort of polishing up moment. And certainly what we find at home is that, you can have a day working from home with all the, my husband's a vicar, so it's all the vicary stuff that comes in, and people that want burying and kind of paperwork and irrational people and abrasive people and all the stats that you need and all the kind of rubbish that goes along with. I'm not saying burying people is rubbish, I'm not saying that. But all the things that are hard work, and we get to the end of the day and we wash up tea, and then there's usually a bit of space when the baby is there and we get to play with the baby before we go off and do whatever needs doing in the evening. And it's almost a quiet time. It's not quiet at all. She's very squawky. It's not a quiet time, but in the sense of space with God time. It feels a bit like that because it's this totally different take on life. It's a totally different, you're walking at snail's pace as she holds onto your fingers around the kitchen, or you're trying to stop her pulling the dog's tail, or whatever. You're talking in rubbish language because she's pre-verbal, even if she will be bilingual one day. It's fun, it's relaxing, it just takes you away from the cares of the day. And I think children remind us of that. It might be a bit soppy to say it's a taste of Eden again, but there is that sense of that shininess of children's mirror reminding us of God. and so perhaps now to move on to how children are an image of God to us, or can be. And this is where the spatula comes in. I brought it with me. I had to take it off the dog, actually, who took a sudden interest in it. This is the spatula in our kitchen. And we've had it for probably 30, 40 years now. It is a very, very boring piece of kit. It is a piece of wood that's a bit scorched and a bit battered, and you use it to do spatulary things. You use it to cook with and stir with and scrape things off a pan with. It's a boring spatula. Now, our baby does not have many toys, for obvious reasons, and so often at tea time you give her just whatever's in the utensil drawer to play with. And in the hands of that baby, this unpromising bit of kit becomes the most magical thing you can imagine. It is unbelievable how long that child can amuse herself with the spatula. You can wave it, you can bang with it, you can bang rhythmically with it, you can drop it on the floor and have it picked up again, you can drop it on the floor again and again, you can drop it on the dog, which is even more exciting. You can chew it, you can taste it, you can sit looking at the patterns in the wood for, I mean, literally for hours. It's quite incredible. And I watched her through a mealtime, and she was content exploring life with this spatula. And there is something, isn't there, about the creativity of God shown in her interaction with this unpromising spatula. This way that something so boring, so basic, so battered and unpromising can become something magical and beautiful and inspiring and educational and a world of wonders in the hands of a creative being. And when I think of myself in my batteredness and my reading glasses and my hearing aids and my aching back and my faults and my failings and my inadequacies, I feel sometimes very, very like this inadequate spatula. And then I think, what does God want to do with me? What can he choose to do with me? And that creativity of God with someone so unpromising reminds me just what a treat it is to be a Christian, actually. So, creativity, I think, the creativity of children is a really vital facet of who God is. And related to that is the way that children play. Don't you think that play is something that we lose so quickly as adults? I got very interested in play during messy church years, in all that time, really about the sort of the theology of play. And I had to be quite careful because, as far as I could tell, the excitement about play, the great thing about play, the significance about play, is that there is no purpose in it. It isn't for any reason at all. It is purely for its own sake. So as soon as I start talking about it in a talk, it starts being purposeful, and then it implodes. But play in itself it's what children do and what they do so well, and it's something about the way that play is purely for its own sake. It's not done for material gain, and it's not done to impress anybody or to gain power over anybody. It's a game, it's for fun, it's for joy. And children can do that. And as adults, we kind of lose that. And this might be a hard question for some of you who, let's face it, a lot of you work 6 days a week and have other things to do on your day off. But just have a moment and then tell the person next to you, what's your spatula? What gives you joy? What do you do just for joy? For no other reason, not to please the bishop, not to impress anybody, not to gain money. But what do you do that's just for fun in your life now? And please don't cry if nothing comes up. Hold it in, hold it in. But just have a moment. Tell the person next to you. Lovely, thank you. What a relief. What a relief that people are still smiling. That's one. Good. I think it's quite significant that when Jesus' disciples were getting a bit serious and a bit power play, that's when Jesus brought a child into the middle of them. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? You know, look at our grown-up game. You know, who's going to be sitting at the right hand of God? You know, let's play the up the ladder game." And Jesus called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." It was a kind of counterpoint, that playful child, a counterpoint to the seriousness and power machinations of the grown-ups. And I think that reminder of a playful God is really helpful. You know, if we're ever tempted to take ourselves too seriously, we can just think about the God who made wombats. You know, what a joy, what a joy. So how else might children be the image of God for us? Just a few ideas, not an exhaustive list at all. I was thinking about unconditional love, and that the way that small children especially, their face lights up when you walk in the room. This baby's face lights up when she sees me, and it's utterly, utterly humbling. It's deeply moving, and it's so everyday. It's such a normal human thing, and yet it moves me right to my gut, that this child just loves me. She just likes me. That's nice. That's a really nice thing. And that unconditional love from a child, I find really hard to take, because life's more complicated than that, isn't it? I'm more horrible than that. She doesn't know. But actually, God knows me inside out and still loves me with that unconditional love. And just thinking about God's face lighting up when I walk in the room is a rather lovely, lovely thing that I often need in life. I think there's something as well in children about that tension between something very, very simple and the absolute unknowableness of what they are doing. For example, she might just be playing with a spatula. It's a very easy, obvious, simple thing. And yet, inside her head, at the age of 6 months, 10 months, the neurons are firing like nobody's business. She's learning all sorts of things. There's oodles going on in her brain that I haven't the foggiest idea about. But we know that it's going on. There's a mystery happening in front of my eyes as this child learns how to drop a spatula, how to hold a spatula, how to wave a spatula, the noise that a spatula makes, the reactions of the adults around her, the reactions of the dog when the spatula lands. All of these things, it's a universe in there that I know nothing of. And it's sometimes when we're faced with children that there's that tension between really simple stuff on the outside and real complexity on the inside. And we're just left like Job going, "Oh, this is too wonderful for me to fathom. I can't get my head around this at all. And I think, again, it's an image of God, the simplicity and the accessibility, and yet the unknowableness. There's something in a child about that too. Something about rhythms and change, I think. One of the pieces of research that was done in Growing Faith pulled out 4 points that are really helpful when you're working with children. And it was about having a purpose, having relationships, we'll touch on that later, hearing the voice of children, and rhythms. And it's a really interesting one, isn't it? That children love rhythm and ritual and routine and repetition. And yet they're also creatures who are changing more rapidly than at any other time in their lives. A child changes from one week to the next. I've just been away with work for a week, and the baby has grown. She's changed. It's what we expect. Change is normal. And yet there's this repetition that they love as well. And I wonder if that's got something to do with God as well, being made in God's image, and God's ever-changing, and yet always the same person. And the way God chooses to work is often through rhythms and seasons and repetition with a difference, like a jazz musician, I suppose, really. I don't know enough about Fleetwood Mac to pull out parallels, but it might be with jazz. I think the last thing, there are so many, the last thing about children and the image of God is something about this, what we see in the icon of the Trinity, this longing for relationship. And everything I see in the baby is about longing to relate, eye contact. My son didn't make eye contact. He's got Asperger's, so eye contact wasn't for him. But for this baby, the eye contact, the reaching out all the time, the holding on, the physical contact. She's longing for relationship. And that is so much who God is. And we see that in the icon, with its space left for a person to join at the table. And actually, when you look at it, I think something about the height of that table suggests that actually you're coming in as a child to that table. It looks like the sort of table where you'd have to kind of peer over the top like a child does. Rebecca Nye talks about children longing for relationship in 4 directions, that they long for relationship with God. She's talking from a Christian point of view. They long for a relationship with others. They long for a good relationship with themselves. And they long for a relationship with the natural world. And when we look at those 4 things, those 4 directions of relationship, we can see that in the God in whose image they're made as well. And perhaps that's a good direction for our churches to be thinking about too. So it's kind of so what? Where does that leave us? Oh, crumbs, where does the time go? What we're trying to do in Growing Faith, which is a tiny team in the Education Office of the Church of England, is we're trying to say we want the culture of the Church of England to change, so that some of this amazingness about children and young people can be much more a part of our church today than it seems to be. We could get terribly depressed about the figures around the lack of children and young people in churches. And it doesn't need repeating. We all know it. In our own church, there are no children in a Sunday service. We've started a message church with the Methodists in the village, but there are no children in our church on a Sunday. We have a lot of work to do. And interestingly, one of the things that this job has made me think is we can't just slap on a sticking plaster. We can't just throw money at this and make the problem go away. As a church, we need to go on a journey of culture change ourselves. We need to walk a bit of a journey from having no children and actually not being that bothered about that fact, to how do we bring everybody on board so we don't have Jackie's terrible experience of could you exclude the child as much as possible, please? How do we make our church a place where everybody is welcomed, the old people and the young people, where everybody feels this is their big extended family that gives them a chance to thrive? So the Growing Faith work is very much about changing the culture, not about sticking plasters, but about changing the culture so we all instinctively put children at the heart of all we do. And the little foundation is working at this, trying to change things. We're a bit like a little cog in a big wheel. The enormous, complicated clockwork that is the Church of England. And we're just trying to change things so that parishes and dioceses have a climate in which it's really straightforward. I won't say easy, because it's never easy, but it's as easy as it possibly can be to prioritise children and young people, and that the culture sitting around all of our work, your work, is that which really wants children to be there and finds ways for that to happen. So we're working on hubs, we're working on some research, we've got networks for practitioners and clergy and teachers and heads and so on to join in with. We've got programmes, we've got this Strategic Leaders programme, which we've just had the residential for the first cohort. It's just been phenomenal, getting together directors of education and vicars and youth workers and children's workers and diocesan youth advisors and teachers, all coming into the same space and learning together how to be better leaders in Christ, in themselves. Wonderful opportunity. So that's been huge fun. But we are trying very hard to work for the parishes and for the dioceses to make this aspiration for children and young people to be at the heart of everything as easy as it possibly can be. Oh, timing. Shall I just share? I've been a bit abstract in many ways. You might be thinking, well, what does it look like? what does this growing faith stuff look like? And some really, really simple stories that have been popping up. One was a church, a parish, where the church and the school had fallen out years ago, and the school had nothing to do with the church whatsoever, even though it was a Church of England school. So a new vicar came in and a new head came in, and the vicar thought, oh, we need to do something about this. We need to change this narrative. And so the vicar went down to the school and said to the head, what would you like us to do for you? And the head was a bit cynical because they knew all about the history and just said, well, if you really want to help, you could send in donuts to the staff room every week. That would be a great help. And kind of was rather dismissive and cynical. So the vicar went away, and every week for the next 6 weeks sent donuts into the staff room every Friday, sent a tray of donuts in. And it took the 6 weeks before in the school newsletter, phrases like, we have such a great relationship with our local church. We're looking forward to working with the church over this term. And it transformed what the broken relationship was. Just a few donuts, for heaven's sake. But also perhaps the vicar going in and saying, not, this is what I need to do in your school. I insist on doing collective worship and I shall come and teach you RE lessons. Nothing like that. What can the church do for you? What can we do for you? Perhaps it was that humility, that childlike humility that made a difference. How else does it look? One head teacher said, she said, well, we do Forest School. So, yeah, so I thought it'd be quite good. I just said to people, look, we'll do Forest Church. If you want to come to church, after school on Friday, just come along and we'll go down to the Forest School bit of the grounds, and we'll do some worship, and we'll roast some marshmallows. And she was expecting 3 or 4 families, and she had 30 families turn up. Not 30 people, 30 families turn up. She had to go and get more marshmallows. And there was that longing to be a community, to be a worshipping community, very excitingly. Lots of stories like that coming up, and more as we go along. I wrote another one down. Oh, yes, so many. Have you heard of children changing places? There's a deanery in Bolton, near Manchester, and they have these deanery workers who are going into the schools, and they've got this plan from toddler groups in churches through preschools, through primary schools, into secondary schools, where they accompany the children in a really kind of dynamic and exciting journey of faith, really. So it goes from wiggle worship for the little ones through into these social action type projects, children changing places, giving a voice, giving a social action projects in the name of faith as they get older and older, and bringing the older ones in to help the younger ones. Loads of really lovely stuff going on. There's a video going round about it at the moment. The Dream Scheme in Salisbury Diocese, where the church and local families and the local school have come together to have this lovely holiday scheme on the estate, where the children and the families decide what project they want to do to make a difference, and as they work towards it, they get tokens which represent money, and if they all communally build up enough tokens, they get a treat at the end of the week. They go down to the Lido and have ice cream or something like that. But they've earned it for themselves, and they've made a difference in their community, doing something that group of children and families want to do. And it's all done by the church with the cooperation of the school. It's a lovely, lovely thing. Lots going on. Let me come into land. We started off with that icon of the Trinity, and another name for it is of course, the hospitality of Abraham, because the story that they think the icon's telling is of that. I think it's probably my favourite story in the Bible, of when Abraham and Sarai are old. They are old and they are tired, and they've not given up hope, and they've not given up faith, but they know it's going to take a miracle for God's promise to be fulfilled. And God had promised them, if you remember, you'll have more descendants than there are stars in the sky or sand in the desert. But there's no sign of that happening. But still, those old people faithfully hang on to God's promise and their relationship with God. And then one day across the desert, there come these 3 visitors, these 3 strangers in the danger of the desert. And Abram is having a siesta, I think, actually, and he could have said, oh, someone else can deal with this, but he doesn't. He gets up and he goes out, like the father in the prodigal son story. He goes out and he greets these strangers as if they are honoured nobility, and brings them in for the most lavish hospitality he can give them. And when you remember that one of his concerns is, Lord, all my inheritance is going to go to this distant relative when I die. He's worried about where his inheritance is going to go. But in that moment, he squanders a large chunk of that inheritance on these visitors. He gives them the best hospitality he possibly can. He pours it out on those 3 visitors. He gives them calf and yogurt and washes their feet and, just gives them everything he can. And somehow, mysteriously, in the story, the three become one, they become the Lord. And out of that hospitality, the promise is renewed. And they say, when we come this way again next year, your wife will have had a baby. And that's when the laughter starts. And that's when it's as if that hospitality has broken through so that the promise can take place. And I just wonder if that icon, which is all about children, even though you can't see the children there, it's all about children. I wonder if that is a model for us in churches today, especially where we feel old and we feel as if we're holding on to a loving God who we know loves us to bits and has a purpose in our life, but we can't quite see it at the moment, and we have no children to pass on our faith to. I wonder if that icon reminding us of the importance of radical, generous, open-hearted hospitality to the stranger, to the outsider, to people who are different from us, is actually the key to being a church for people of all ages.